Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Freed, and I am here to re-record my presentation from the NADA Virtual Fit Fest in 2026. This was originally recorded on February 21st, 2026 for 33 participants, but I am re-recording due to having people on camera and interacting and being in the chat. So I'm going to re-record this how it was presented. I will also include all the discussion questions that were prompted in the chat. So let's get started. My presentation was on the Readiness Reset for sleep, stress, and pain management for health. And the first prompted question was, on a scale of 1 to 10, how ready do you feel today? And all participants dropped it in the chat. And since this is for readiness, I wanted to make sure that we set the tone on how we're feeling. So our course objectives. Today we are going to discuss three different pillars of recovery and readiness. So we will define readiness and its role in performance and recovery, explain how sleep, stress, and pain interact to affect health outcomes, and then finish by applying practical strategies to improve client readiness. So I think that first it's very important for us to define readiness, since that is what we will be referring to today in all different realms. So readiness is defined as a holistic daily assessment of an individual's or an athlete's current physical, mental, and emotional capacity to perform at the best, which is determined by balancing obviously key things such as training, stress, and recovery. We will be diving into three different topic areas today, including sleep, stress, and chronic pain, and how they impact one another. And then we will wrap up with some actionable items at the very end that you can take to use with your clients. So just for some brainstorming to start and see where we're at as a group, which usually comes first for your clients? Poor sleep, poor stress, or chronic pain? Go ahead and drop it in the chat and let's hear your responses. So starting with sleep, I think it's important for us to understand the capacity of where we're at as a society and understanding sleep health in general for us to then acknowledge how important it is. So several years ago, the CDC actually declared insufficient sleep as a public health concern. 1 in 3 adults in the United States reported not getting at least 7 hours of sleep. And as we know, it is recommended that adults get 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. And this is really alarming that we have over 35% of adults that are sleeping less than this. But to add another layer onto this, 50 to 70 million struggle with sleep disorders. So not only are they struggling with sleep, they're also being diagnosed with a sleep disorder. Also, adults who sleep less than 6 hours per night report having about 2.4% higher of productivity loss at work compared to those who are sleeping the recommended 7 to 9 hours. So to put this in perspective of the entire United States, this is equivalent to about 1.23 million working days due to insufficient sleep. So this also then corresponds to 9.9 million working hours, which is a lot and is having a huge significant economic impact on the US. And they further dug into these numbers and they found that insufficient sleep is costing the US in 2020 $433 billion. And this is only expected to increase. So by 2030, this is expected to increase to $456 billion through economic and healthcare costs. So we understand that this is truly a public health concern, so what can we do about it? Getting into the sleep side of things, and I think this is where it's really important for us to understand what does it mean through sleep cycles and how does this work in our day-to-day. So with sleep, there's one very specific things that we like to talk about, and it's our sleep-wake cycle. And there are two key components that play into our sleep-wake cycle. They are sleep urge and sleep need. So as you can see on this graph, sleep urge is obviously in the red, and this is ultimately when you are sleeping. And things like sunlight exposure, routine and consistency, workouts, all of these things are obviously impacting our sleep urge and making us sleepy. The other side of this is our sleep need. So same thing through exercise, through movement, through our day-to-day, our sleep need continues to build up. And then we hit that point at the top of the graph, that's the sleep pressure. And that's then when we start to have the sleep urge, when we want to shut our eyes, we start to doze off, we might have some heavy eyes. But this is a cycle that continues to happen every single day. So as we have that sleep urge to at nighttime, and then throughout the day we're building sleep need to need the urge to sleep again. And this also has an impact on melatonin and cortisol as well. So similar to sleep urge, sleep need, our melatonin and cortisol levels are changing throughout the day. So with that need, the melatonin and cortisol in our bodies are working in our favor. So melatonin and cortisol have an inverse relationship with one another, as in, you can see, one goes up and the other goes down. As the sun goes down and things get darker, this is when melatonin starts to secrete in our bodies, and this is why we start to get sleepy. At around midnight, we are at peak melatonin, and cortisol bottoms out, as you can see in the graph. Post midnight, melatonin levels gradually start to fall while cortisol levels begin to rise. So this is where it's important to managing our stress, particularly in the afternoon before bed, is pivotal for sleeping, because if stress is high, melatonin will have a hard time getting into the bloodstream fast enough to do its job. So this is why it sometimes prevents us to not go to bed. But something else I want to point out about this melatonin and cortisol impact is a lot of times we have this 2 p.m. feeling. So a lot of times people get very sleepy at 2 p.m. and some of this is actually the natural dip in our circadian rhythm. And it's programmed this way for us to have a sort of a mini reset. So as melatonin secretion into the bloodstream starts around this time, levels are very low and rise throughout the night, when cortisol is also low. So our body temperature dips at this time, and truly we don't have much production of either one. So that is why a lot of times we'll get sleepy at 2 p.m. Also sometimes because of caffeine crash, but we'll get to that later. So now that we understand these cycles and how it works throughout a day, we're going to talk about the actual sleep cycles and the stages of sleep that we go through. So each stage of sleep is very important because they all have different functions for us in recovery. So stage 1 is non-REM or N1, and it's typically about 1 to 7 minutes. And we consider this the dozing stage, and it's the body's way of easing into sleep. So this stage is also, if someone were to meditate, this is typically where they will stay in their meditation. From there, we go into stage 2, which is either N2 or light sleep, and this is about 10 to 25 minutes. So at this point, we're sensitive to light and noise, our body temperature and heart rate begin to drop in preparation for sleep, our sensory organs start to wind down, and we're starting to get into that sleep stage. From there, we're going into stage 3, which is also N3 or deep sleep. And this is where we are physically repairing our body. So our muscles, our actual immune system is working. There are a lot of things that are going into this stage through tissue repair and growth, but also in this stage, the body releases the growth hormone, and that helps us with the repair of muscles, bones, and cells. Also in this stage, which is pretty interesting, is that cellular energy restores, especially ATP, are replenished, which are going to prep our body for the next day. So this stage, all from a physical standpoint. And then in contrast, the final sleep cycle stage is REM sleep, and also known for rapid eye movement. This is about 10 to 60 minutes, and this is for our cognitive and emotional regulation and really where dreams occur. That's how it got its name. So the key thing of this stage is that it cleanses the brain by removing buildup waste produced throughout the day. Short-term memories are inputted into long-term memories. This is also where a lot of problem solving and creativity stems from. There's also emotional regulation and energy balance. And in this stage as well, hormone secretion and metabolism are improved, repaired, etc., etc. So we need all four of these stages to really support our sleep. But next, we're going to talk about what this looks like in actual night. So here are those sleep stages that we just talked about in a graph. Of course, this would be if you had a perfect night of sleep, which we know not everyone does every single night. So you should go through a minimum of 4 sleep cycles throughout your night. So breaking this down and what this means for us. In stage 1, as we know, N1, we're in here for about 1 to 7 minutes. So it's easy to wake someone up during this phase of sleep, but if a person isn't disturbed, they can move quickly into stage 2. As the night unfolds, an uninterrupted sleeper may not spend more time in stage 1 as they move further into their sleep cycles. So once they go to bed, they're done in this stage. That's when stage 2 comes into play, or N2, which we know is about 10 to 25 minutes. During stage 2, the body enters a more subdued state where body temperature drops, muscles relax, and heart rate and breathing slow. At the same time, eye movement stops and brain activity slows, though there are short bursts of activity through this stage. As we know, it can last 10 to 25 minutes, but throughout the night, this stage can actually become longer. So collectively, a person typically spends about half their sleep in this N2 area. From there, we go into stage 3, N3 or deep sleep. And it's harder to wake someone up if they're in this phase. Muscle tone, pulse, and breathing rates are all decreased. The brain activity has an identifiable pattern of what we know as delta waves. And for this reason, sometimes you will hear this N3 actually called delta sleep or slow wave sleep as different names. You spend the most time, or should spend the most time, in deep sleep during the first half of the night. And during these early stages, N3 can commonly last for about 20 to 40 minutes, but as you continue to sleep, these stages get shorter and then more time is spent in REM, as you can see in the graph below. Finally, the REM sleep piece, which, as we said, rapid eye movement, it's about 10 to 60 minutes, and this is where your brain actively picks up any type of nearing levels seen when you're awake, which is pretty interesting. At the same time, the body experiences something that we call temporary paralysis in the muscles, with 2 exceptions: the eyes and the muscles that control breathing. Even though they're closed, the eyes move rapidly, which is how the stage gets its name. So REM sleep is also known for where the most vivid dreams happen, which is explained by the significant uptick in our brain activity. So dreams occur in any stage throughout the night, but they're a lot less common to occur in a non-REM period. And then, as noted in the graph, as the night goes on, REM stages should ideally get longer, especially in that second half of the night. While the first REM stage may only last a few minutes, later stages can last around an hour long in time. In total, REM stages make up about 25% of sleep in adults. So having a full sleep cycle is typically going to be about 90 minutes, which is why we always tell people if they're going to take a nap in the day, it should be less than 20 minutes because that's prior to getting into those deep sleep cycles, or it should be over 90 minutes, so then they finish an entire sleep cycle. When you wake up in the midst of deep sleep or REM sleep, that's when you actually start to become very groggy because, right, you're in those heaviest parts of sleeping. So you're groggy, you don't feel fully awake, which can happen just in general if like an alarm goes off and you're in the middle of a sleep cycle. So something very important to think about when we are discussing sleep throughout the night. But now knowing this information, a prompt for the chat: would you adjust training based on a poor night's sleep for a client, knowing what you know about these sleep cycles? So getting into how we can improve our sleep. So there are 3 buckets in which we generally lump human behaviors that either have a positive or negative impact on sleep. And that's also on, going back to the first slide, sleep pressure, right? Sleepiness, heaviness, really creating that sleep urge. So those three buckets are routine and consistency, environment, and then habits. So starting off with routine and consistency, there are lots of different things that we can do to set ourselves up for success through the morning, through the daytime, and in the evening. One big thing is to make sure that we are maintaining a fairly consistent sleep and wake cycle and wake time, because our body is then used to those times. We can also make sure that we want to integrate some sunlight first thing in the morning, easing into our day, and then really being active throughout the day, having some regular movement, working out, social connection, having purpose, having structure. And then as we go throughout our day, in the final part, we want to have a nice evening wind down. So a warm shower, maybe some journaling, some thought dumping from the day, maybe reading a book, stretching, foam rolling, light activity here. We want to make sure that we're not working out, doing a HIIT workout or something very high intensity right before bed, because then our cortisol is spiked and our heart rate is up. So we want to make sure that we're doing things that will decompress our system and wind down for the day. A body scan can be really helpful, meditation, breath work, anything that's going to calm us down. But we always consider that wind down routine a power down hour, where we're starting to turn off our electronics and really focus on powering down and being able to get ready for bed. We also want to make sure that our bedtime environment is good for us. It's four things that we look into: safe, inviting, dark, and cool. So with being inviting, we want to make sure our mattress is comfortable, our pillow is comfortable. You actually are supposed to replace your pillow every 3 to 6 months, which is pretty crazy to think about because a lot of people do not do that. So that is one thing to start doing in your routine, but making sure we're setting ourselves up for success. Eliminating clutter to make it feel safe, to feel comfortable. It should be dark in there, so making sure that you are covering up any type of bright lights coming through, whether it be through blackout curtains and or even just if you have a TV in the bedroom, like the lights on the TV, making sure that it is a completely dark environment. And then cool is the other part. The ideal temperature for sleeping is actually 62 to 68 degrees, which, being in the West, whenever I teach on sleep, I always get the comment about our Phoenix individuals, our Arizona individuals, where they say, Lauren, we are not paying the bill to keep it at 62 degrees in the summertime. So I do understand that, but trying to have a cooler temperature so we can sleep better. Going off of that light exposure piece, it is very important for us to focus on what light exposure we are getting throughout the day. So getting blue light in the morning from the sunrise will help us energize our body, but because it is an energizer for our body, we do not want that then in the evening time. As we get into the evening time, we want more orange red light exposure to then start to have the body and brain secrete melatonin. So this is the cue for melatonin secretion, which is really important to note. However, if we still expose ourselves to blue light, then we're suppressing our melatonin production. And the other thing I want to note that's not related to light exposure in this is also what we're consuming at night. So we talk about turning our phones off, turning our TV off. And yes, a huge part of that is because of the blue light on the screen. But then a lot of people say, well, I can just turn night mode on, which ultimately is turning the blue light off. However, it's not just about the screen brightness, it's also about what we're consuming. If it's horror, if it's news, if it's something negative, then our brain is also not going to want to shut off for us to truly go to bed. So keep in mind, light is important, but also consumption is equally as important for us. The next part with this is stimulant management, and this is something that is really important and sometimes we don't necessarily think about to a full extent. So first things first, caffeine, because I know that a lot of people love their caffeine, but the most important thing about caffeine is it does have a half-life of about 6 hours. So back to what I was saying when we were talking about melatonin and cortisol, that 2 p.m. crash that I mentioned. our body is already crashing, right? Because we're leveling out on cortisol and on melatonin. However, with that being said, a lot of times if caffeine has a half-life of 6 hours, that is also when we are coming down from our caffeine crash. So it's a double whammy. But the negative part is then a lot of people, because they are tired at that time, they then will take more caffeine to wake themselves up, but then half-life, right? It's still in our bodies when we have to go to bed. So this is causing us to be awake when we actually need to be sleeping. And we want to build that sleep pressure to make sure that we are tired for when we go to bed. So caffeine is probably one of the easiest behavior changes to do to stop that caffeine consumption early on in the morning or earlier on in the day, so then you are building that sleep pressure to want to sleep at night. The other thing that I really want to point out about this is alcohol and cannabis. They are strong REM sleep suppressors. So they actually sedate the brain activity, causing your brain to decrease its ability to go through the REM cycle, which is our overnight therapy. So a lot of times when people wake up, they don't feel rested. And additionally, the interesting part about this is that our heart rate stays really high because your body is trying to metabolize these substances. So after one drink of alcohol, our body is actually going through withdrawals through the night, which is why our heart rate is staying so high. So being mindful of this, because right, we want to get through all of those cycles and we don't want to suppress our brain activity during that time because we can't process our memories. And a lot of times we'll actually talk about a REM rebound for people who are users of marijuana and alcohol and some psychedelics, because they are suppressing all of their memories and they're not having brain activity or light brain, full on brain activity during that REM cycle. If all of a sudden after years they stop, they are going to go through what we call a REM rebound and experience serious nightmares, night terrors, and more, because your mind and body is trying to make up for all of that time of suppressed memory. So something to be thinking about, especially when working with populations such as veterans or first responders, because that is a common thing that we see in those populations when referring to sleep, because they are using substances to suppress to get to fall asleep. However, on the contrary, it's then harmful in the future. So being mindful of things, but those are highlights for stimulant management that are really important for us to think about. So moving on into stress. So 74% of adults report being so stressed that they are overwhelmed and unable to cope. In about 76% of adults, stress predicted less physical activity and a more sedentary behavior, which is important to think about when we talk about movement and being active throughout the day. And more than 80% of US workers report experiencing high workplace stress, which over 50% of workers say that stress from their job also impacts their home life. And this is a little concerning because job stress is associated with 23% of increase of coronary heart disease and 30% increase risk of stroke. So we know as a society that people are fairly stressed out, especially stemming from their jobs. So we need to figure out what we can do to combat that stress. So starting with the human function curve. So there is good stress and there is bad stress. And that's a really important thing to note, because some people think all stress is bad and it is not all bad. There is something that we call EU stress, EU stress, and this is our good stress. This would be like a job promotion or a wedding or having a new baby, right? They're good things that are happening in our lives, but they do cause some type of stress. We can also have very short stress cycles like public speaking, right? That is an instant, for a lot of people, stress response. But once you do it, you're good. Versus something that's long term that you're dealing with over time after time after time, which might be a very stressful job that every single day there's something else and you've been doing this for years. So now you're building this chronic stress in your body, which is then causing a ton of other problems. So the thing that's most important about this human curve is that we want to be in a comfort zone. We want to have some stress. We need stress because that is our body alarming us that something's going wrong. So stress does save us. And we think about that in this point of fight or flight, right? If we're in a dangerous situation, then our body goes in fight or flight and it's there to save us. However, if we are then in this situation and we're starting to never come out of that cycle, this is when exhaustion happens. This is when a lot of people start to get sick because our immune system is suppressed. And we're also then having those prolonged pieces of cortisol being released, which can be detrimental to our body. So thinking about how we close the stress cycle. So after we have a big stressor, we're then closing the stress cycle and being in rest and digest. It's interesting because cortisol is, when it's released for prolonged times, it becomes maladaptive, meaning it is not an appropriate reaction and is detrimental to the body, right? Like we were saying, but is then actually doing the opposite of what it's supposed to do. So it becomes a source of inflammation in the body and actually exasperates the stress and fear response. So it's interesting because excess or prolonged cortisol secretion can then have that constant worrisome feeling in the body and the constant arousal of stress. So really important for us to think about those pieces, just because it is the autonomic nervous system releases the hormones for cortisol and adrenaline. So we want to make sure that we are maintaining our body to make sure that we're staying in that fight or flight, goes into a circle to rest and digest. So human curve, very important. We do need stress to some extent, but not prolonged. Because how does it affect the body? It affects the body in all different areas, and it's really important, especially in the brain, to note that stress, when long-term, it can actually shrink the hippocampus, which is the part in the brain responsible for learning and memory. And it then enlarges the amygdala, which is the fear center, leading to more anxiety, more reactivity, more fight, flight, freeze, and less memory, focus, and calmness. However, the good news is your brain is capable of bouncing back due to neuroplasticity. So things to keep in mind is that, yes, stress is impacting the brain and truly changing the dynamic of it. However, it's also impacting your cardiovascular health because it's increasing your blood pressure, increasing your heart rate, it's plummeting your immune system. A lot of times high stress is also then linked to digestive issues because we talk about the brain and stomach connection. So that's a huge factor. We can get a lot of tension in our neck, our shoulders, get headaches, obviously impact our sleep, right? There are a lot of different areas that we go through that have a huge impact on stress. So it's important for us to address these things because it does have a full body effect. So something that I like to do with clients is what we call stress and body mapping, and it really helps people understand where your body is holding stress. So here's an example of what body mapping looks like, and this is really helpful for when somebody is talking to a health professional, whether it be your client discussing with you or them discussing with their doctor. They can actually track where stress is holding in their body. If there's somebody who gets constant headaches, maybe they have tension in their neck and shoulders. Really important to know, like if they have an elevated heart rate or elevated blood pressure, maybe they feel like their shoulders are starting to collapse in, they have some digestive issues, and then also just being aware of where tension is in the body as well. Maybe it's that they have tight hip flexors, tight glutes, a tight lower back, right? Because this is all One related to chronic pain and inflammation, which we'll get to in the next section, but it's also related to where stress is in the body. So if we can start to map this out, we can also start to then help figure out, what is a recovery plan for us? What is going to help us from a movement standpoint versus then a mental health and recovery standpoint? So stress mapping is a really important activity for us, and this can change over time. And I encourage you to encourage your clients to do this maybe every quarter. Once they start to implement some type of routine that will help them with their sleep, with their stress, and with their pain. So something to think about in the chat. What are signs that you see in your clients that show that their nervous system is overloaded? How are they showing up to your training sessions, your classes, et cetera, et cetera? Awesome. So going into our last section before we tie this all together, chronic pain and inflammation. So chronic pain is obviously an epidemic that silently shapes our workforce. The CDC reports that 51.6 million US adults, which is about 21% of the population, lives with chronic pain, and 7% of those individuals actually have high impact chronic pain that consistently restricts them from work and daily life. Pain doesn't exist in isolation. It's deeply tied to mental health because unmanaged pain can a lot of times lead to depression, to anxiety, substance abuse, and even cognitive decline. Pain leads to an average of 10.3 missed workdays per employee per year, which, similar to sleep, it then is causing us to be in a huge economic impact. And pain, if you thought sleep was high, pain is actually much higher. So in 2025 analysis is estimated that $722.8 billion were spent for chronic pain, including medical care and economic cost through lost productivity. So we know that chronic pain is equally as important as these other items. So chronic pain is pretty interesting because there's something that we consider these pain pathways. So it can sometimes be difficult to pinpoint chronic pain in the body due to a process called central sensitization. Some pains are due to structural problems in the brain, while other pains are due to neural circuits in the brain. So the pain is generated by the subconscious brain, which it feels that we need to protect of some kind, right? It will send a message that our body is in pain, which we need, similar to stress, we need that response. But then it can become overprotective. So it's trying to keep us alive, but it can then become overprotective and continue to send us these messages, even if we don't need them anymore. So you can see in the chart, acute pain versus then that pain in the centralized area. It just keeps going and those neurons keep firing. And that is when we start to need to have the rewire, because the associations between these neurons and pain get so strong that they continue to fire, and it's causing a lot more pain in the body. So I always like to use the example of, think of a city that has just one highway leading into it. Now imagine that city grows, multiple highways are built leading into the city and out of the city. So very similar with pain, as symptoms develop and expand, it's hard to pinpoint the location of the problem due to these multiple pathways or highways. So something to keep in mind that is important is that even though we have this going on, the brain can learn and unlearn pain, which is really important for us to note. So if we understand the cycle, this is when we can break it and we can unlearn these pain factors. So certain factors could magnify the experience of pain. These include stressful life events, mental health issues, as we talked about before, depression, anxiety, PTSD, social isolation, maybe a decrease in ability to do the things that you really enjoy due to pain, overexertion, underexertion. And really, when we start to decondition the body and get into that avoidance and withdrawal, we're then just causing more pain in our body because then we're not moving. So it can be really hard to break this cycle because we can feel unmotivated or it can feel painful to move. However, those things are going to help us. So the thing that we want to note here is that pain is very subjective and it's based on individual experience. So one thing that I really encourage you to start to tell clients is start to do some evaluating of your pain. Use a pain scale from 0 to 10 and start tracking and doing some pain journaling, because then when we are talking to health professionals, whether it be doctors or trainers, we can start to say, okay, I have a migraine today. My migraine pain is a 2 out of 10. But tomorrow it's an 8 out of 10. So we can start to track, like, what do these patterns look like over time, and start to try to help the onset of chronic pain to then hopefully break this cycle and not have the repercussions in the long run. So another important thing with this is the biopsychosocial factors that impact pain. So really understanding that pain cycle, we have to understand these 3 pillars: biological being medical-based stuff, so perception of pain, inflammation of the body, brain function, disease severity; the psychological factors, emotions, attention, mood, trauma, stress, coping skills; and then also the social piece of it, so cultural factors, relationships, jobs, hobbies, socioeconomic status. All of these different pieces fall into what we call this biopsychosocial scale. And it's generally accepted as the most useful approach for understanding relevant clinical factors associated with chronic pain experience, because we know this interchangeable sort of factors that we're going through typically are going to impact somebody's pain. So we know that physical symptoms, psychological processes, and social conditions interact with one another, which understanding how they play into each other will also help us break those cycles. So something really important for us to be able to focus on and help our clients. For example, with this, chronic pain can significantly impair the physical, biological function, making it difficult to perform our daily activities and disrupting sleep. This can contribute to fatigue and influence mood, often leading to anxiety, depression, maybe some irritable feelings, some anger. Chronic pain can also negatively then impact the social function, because we are having these thoughts and feelings that then we're reducing our social activity and we're not connecting with others, which then is in that cycle that is then falling into what we need to break. So there are a lot of factors for us to understand that can impact pain overall. So something for us to then talk about is the inflammation piece of it. So acute versus chronic inflammation, and there are differences with this, and not all pain and inflammation signals are bad. So acute inflammation is the good inflammation that fends off foreign invaders and heals injuries. Acute pain is the body's most alarming and intense sensation, whose purpose is to stop us from further injuring ourselves. For example, if you are cooking and you touch a hot stove by accident, right, you immediately have those pain signals. This is hot. This is not comfortable for the body. So this can cause injury, infection, allergic reactions. It can cause a lot of things, but it's our body ultimately defending something. Now, chronic inflammation, on the other hand, often begins with a similar cellular response, but then morphs into a lingering state that persists far longer than acute inflammation. So over time, inflammation can damage healthy cells and organs, and it can cause constant pain in muscles, tissues, and joints. So this is where, if we do not manage it, right, it can start to have persistent infections, autoimmune disorders, exposure to toxins, lifestyle factors, obesity, chronic stress, and it will cause this vicious cycle to start to occur. So if we can stop our inflammation or pain at the acute stage and never get to the chronic piece, this is great for our body. So the other piece of this are our inflammatory markers. So CRP is part of a group of proteins that increase in response to inflammation. The liver produces CRP and releases it into the bloodstream when inflammation is present. Doctors may use CRP tests to monitor inflammatory diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, or to assess the effectiveness of treatment. And a wide range of variety and inflammatory conditions can cause elevated CRP levels. So they are some of these different rheumatoid arthritis, we mentioned lupus, Crohn's disease is also in here, but there's various things that causes this inflammation, and it can be found through a simple blood test. On the other hand, IL-6 is a pro-inflammatory response that stimulates the production of acute phase proteins in the liver and can induce fever. So this plays a key role in the acute phase, but this then, when levels are elevated in the body, it can cause inflammatory diseases. So important to note these two parameters, and if somebody is really struggling with inflammation in the body, chronic pain, etc., I would encourage them to go to a doctor for testing of these markers to see where they're at and see what their levels are, if they're elevated, X, Y, and Z. Lifestyle changes can help lower both of these in the body. So once they are elevated, that doesn't mean that they have to stay elevated. So important things to think about. We also do talk about stimulant management from a chronic pain standpoint. There is some short-term effects that people will talk about with stimulants, and sometimes we'll talk about the relationship between pain and tobacco, with pain motivating nicotine use and vice versa. So there's a lot of things for stimulants that we know nicotine can affect the nervous system by altering the way pain signals are processed. So while some may experience short-term relief due to its effects on dopamine release, long-term use of nicotine can actually worsen chronic pain. It reduces the blood flow. It exacerbates conditions like back pain and nerve damage. There's also obviously the piece of cannabis and THC. Short term, it may reduce pain. However, it does alter those sleep stages like we talked about before. Also, for somebody that has underlying mental health conditions, this is not necessarily a great problem solver for pain, because then it can cause a lot more issues with that brain activity we talked about with sleep. So overall, same thing, big things to keep in mind and read up on for stimulants, but a lot of ones for the caffeine piece and the energy drinks is also the sugar content in it, the processed chemicals that are in it. So being mindful of making sure that we are keeping in mind whole foods and nutrition, and eliminating processed foods, added sugars, to also help not only from a stimulant management side, but from a nutrition side with the inflammation in the body. So bring it all together. This is kind of like, is it the chicken or is it the egg scenario? So it can be hard to figure out what was the original starter of the pain, the sleep, or the stress. And because a lot of times these do go hand in hand. Frequently, people with chronic pain find it difficult to sleep, or sleep is often disrupted by long night awakenings. Obviously, it can be hard to sleep or go to sleep because of stress. So there's a lot of different factors in this element, and it's sometimes hard to know what is the cause and what's the consequence, because it is a biodirectional relationship. But we do know that 70 to 80% of people with chronic pain do have sleep disturbances. So it is something that we want to look at and be mindful of. And if we can pinpoint where it's starting from or where it has stemmed from in the past, that can be helpful for us. So what can we do to help support it? It's important for us to look at our clients with a holistic lens and be able to support all different areas of wellness to help break the cycles. So movement, obviously we know movement is medicine. We want to make sure that we're getting movement throughout our day. It's also going to increase our sleep urge to make us sleepy, but making sure we have balanced activities, multiple modalities, that we are taking active recovery days. We need our body to recover, really focusing on some self-myofascial release, some corrective exercise, but making sure that we're fully getting steps in, strength in, but also recovery in. From a nutrition standpoint, we mentioned this, the anti-inflammatory foods, making sure we have proper hydration, limiting those added sugars and processed foods. And I always say the 80-20 rule, right? We're not going to deprive ourselves of everything that we love. However, being cautious of when we're consuming it. From a mental and emotional wellness standpoint, really starting to manage our stressors, figuring out what those are, building resilience, having a positive mindset, practicing gratitude, having purpose in life, and also seeking out some psychotherapy when needed. There is amazing cognitive behavioral therapy for chronic pain and also cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. So diving into psychotherapy when it's needed and really working for our mental health, which will support us in all these areas. From a sleep standpoint, we talked about routine, environment, those daily habits, making sure that we are managing our stimulants. Caffeine intake is a big one. And then also I just mentioned the psychotherapy piece, CBT for insomnia is also really great modality and sort of like the gold standard in the industry for psychotherapy for sleep. So the last thing that I want to cover today, and hopefully this is a tool that you will take with you, that you'll use for yourself, you'll use with your clients, but it's a personal energy and readiness audit. And this is something that I encourage you to encourage others to use maybe on a quarterly basis. And it assesses your physical energy, your emotional energy, your mental energy, and your spiritual energy based on some different statements and scenarios. Once you add up every category, there is a score interpretation that will base your scores on your energy management skills and your readiness. So this is really important to note, where is somebody at? Maybe in the first quarter of the year, they're really strong in their physical energy, but then they're really low in their mental energy. And then maybe in the second quarter, it balances out. But this is really important for us to realize where we're at. So we know, one, where are we doing really well? Where do we need to focus? But also, where is this readiness piece going to help us through different improvements and changes that we make that we just talked about on the last slide. So one thing that I want to end with this is, what's one conversation you want or need to have with your clients to really help them on their readiness journey? This is the references throughout the presentation that were used. And then finally, this is my contact information. It has been absolutely wonderful to be able to present this, and I loved being able to teach everyone at the Native Fit Fest conference. We had an amazing group with a lot of positive feedback that came out of it, and I was able to send the recording out to several individuals and have lots of post conversations with them too, to also answer some questions and further talk about how to integrate this into their training and with their clients. So it has been wonderful, and I hope everyone has a great day.